Welcome everyone to my first explainer. This episode's topic, the Nordic Gods. Gods are, understandably, one of the first things that people look for when they're investigating a new or different kind of spirituality, and they're coming out of something informed by predominantly Christian or other similar religious norms, where gods are really important. Specifically, one particular god who is said to be the only god in existence. This therefore, is part of why I think one of the first places that people go to when they look at any kind of paganism or heathenry is the gods. Particularly the fact that pagans generally, and heathens in particular, have many of them. I've often joked that the phrase godless heathen is probably one of the most inaccurate that I've ever heard of. I mean, I personally lose track of how many gods we have. And this is not unusual in pagan or even broadly polytheistic spiritualities. This multiplicity of gods is one of the most obvious differences between pagan and heathen spirituality and Christianity, along with other similar monotheistic religions. That tends to be why I think in our heavily Christian-dominated society, it's one of the first things that people look to when they're going, hey, what's the story with this particular religion? One problem that also comes from this broader tendency is that Christian notions about how gods are supposed to work, how deity is supposed to work, and what deity represents also tend to get carried over a little less critically than they should be. And this ends up with a somewhat distorted understanding about how deity works in a heathen and other pagan contexts. That's what brings me to the subject of this episode, the Nordic Gods. What I'm going to be doing with this explainer is giving you a short rundown of what are some important tendencies that you see with the Nordic gods generally. What are some themes and attributes that are common and shared amongst them? And what does this mean when you're talking about heathen spirituality? For folks that are tuning in looking for a complete rundown of all of the different gods, I will be getting to each of the different groups that make up the Nordic gods in later explainers over the course of this year, so keep an eye out for those more specific episodes. This one is more introducing some general concepts and showing how these gods, as well as polytheistic deity generally, is different from the Christian concept of deity. First things first is a really critical concept for understanding polytheistic deity generally, and that is not all gods are the same. And this isn't just, Thor is a different deity from Zeus, or Odin is not the same as Loki, or, stuff like that. It goes a little deeper than that. When I'm saying not all gods are the same, what I mean is each particular culture that has developed around the world that has something that you could broadly call a god. And let's keep in mind the word God and how we understand it is really strongly filtered through a lot of Christian assumptions about what deity even means, has their own understanding of what that actually means. And there's a huge range of variety around how things that are called deity, how separate those things are from the material world, what their attributes, limitations, and abilities are, and what this implies for the spiritual practitioner. One example of these different understandings of gods is something I've brought up before on the podcast, which is the difference between hard and soft polytheism. Hard polytheism is where there's clear defining boundaries between what gods are what, such as, for example, Zeus in Greek and Hellenic myth is always Zeus. He might take the form of a swan or a bull or a shower of gold coins or any number of other things, but he's still ultimately Zeus. Whereas soft polytheism is where the boundaries between different deities get a little blurry. And when I'm saying blurry, I don't mean in the somewhat confusing way that you see lots of different kennings, names, and titles attributed to gods within the Nordic practice that sometimes blur the lines between which god is which. I mean outright situations where gods sort of blur into each other. One example of this kind of soft polytheism in the modern pagan movement can be found in Wicca, where in Wiccan theology, the god of Wicca is considered to represent all gods, and the goddess of Wicca is considered to represent and be all goddesses. So, within that context, Zeus, Cernunnos, and Thor are equally the god, as much as Isis, Inanna, and Kali are the goddess. There's also examples from historical polytheisms, like, say, within Vedic-derived practices in South Asia and other forms that are referred to often as Hindu, where you have the concept of the Trimurti of Brahman, Vishnu, and Shiva, where these different distinct entities are the same entity enacting different roles and playing different parts within a greater cosmic cycle. Brahma is always Brahma, except when Brahma is Vishnu, and Vishnu is Vishnu, except sometimes when they are playing the role of Shiva. And this is sort of a good example, I think, of this soft versus hard polytheism distinction. If this sort of soft versus hard polytheism of boundaries between different gods could be seen as one axis on a graph, then the other one, if you could put these things on a graph, that is, would be the distance between gods and what it is they represent, which is to say, the material world. On one extreme, when we're talking about the concept of deity on a global scale, you have the example of Christianity and Islam, where you have what is understood as transcendental monotheism. That is to say, there is one God, and that God is above, beyond, and superior to the material world as we understand it. On the other hand, we have what Rune Rasmussen over at Nordic Animism calls continuous cosmology. And one of the best examples that I'm familiar with is Japanese practice of Shinto, the indigenous, you could say, polytheistic and animistic form of spirituality that emerged within the Japanese archipelago. In this case, the word kami is used to refer to everything from animistic beings associated with things like your desk, your house, even like, say, your cell phone, or the tree that is out on the street, all the way up to Amaterasu kami, which is essentially the goddess of the sun, but is still treated as a kami. Granted, an exceptionally powerful, important, influential kami that plays very important roles within Shinto myth and spirituality, but is still within that umbrella of kami. On one end of the spectrum, which is over with Christianity and Islam, you have deity that is above, beyond, and transcendent from reality as we understand it, while still being the architect and ruler of everything. Whereas on the other end, where we're talking about things like Shinto practice, the line between deity and the material world doesn't really exist. Those beings that could be described as gods within Shinto practice are simply another form of a kind of power that exists within the world that is not really transcendental or removed or in any way separate from the world and what it is that it represents. It's not even separated from other beings that exist within the world. mean, one of the greatest examples you can see for the distinction between the two is when we go back over to Christianity and we look over things like complex hierarchies of angels that exist within Christian lore and spirituality. These beings are important, but they exist in gradations of hierarchy that points all the way up to God being at the peak of the pyramid and everything else falling down on different levels beneath it. It's also important to remember that these proverbial axes that I'm talking about should be seen more as guidelines than as mathematical ranges and absolutes. They give you a sense of direction, but they don't really fully capture the whole range of polytheistic, animistic, and otherwise non-monotheistic spirituality that exists out in the world. So where then do the Nordic gods fall within this general range of possibility? And what are some particular attributes that set them apart from other concepts of God and deity? Based on available source material, I think it's safe to say that the Nordic gods fall somewhat closer to the Shinto end of the spectrum. There is more of a sense of what you could call hard polytheism, in the sense of that while Odin, as one of the best examples, may take on many different forms and disguises and collects names like other folks would collect things like coins or touristy trinkets or whatever else it is that's your particular special interest. At the end of the day, he's still Odin. That said, the gods do seem to exist more in a space of continuous cosmology rather than being sharply separated from what exists in the other worlds. The gods of all the different groups of Nordic gods regularly travel to each other's realms as well as to this realm, sometimes get themselves involved in different affairs, and also, especially when we talk about the Jotnar, really blur the line between animistic power of place and a thing that you could call deity. The Nordic gods are also, unlike gods in other cultures and societies, subject to injury and even potentially death. I also think, and this is my particular inference based on my reading of the source material, that they do change over time, or at least over the course of mythic cycles. I don't think, for example, that it's a stretch to say the Odin who led his brothers in rising against Ymir and shared the wisdom of the runes with all the denizens of all the 9 worlds is the same Odin in the sense of change over time, in the way that you today are not the same person that you were 10, 5, or even 1 year ago, as the Odin who, at the beginning of the Voluspa, uses magic to compel the nameless Sirius to come forth from her grave, which is kind of like her house when you think about it, and give answers to questions that he demands to have answered. The Nordic gods are also, generally speaking, not perfect beings. What I mean by that is their abilities, power, knowledge, and influence has limits. They most certainly make mistakes. Sometimes they do things that are questionable and even outright not ethical. And even in their forms, there's specific examples of gods who are scarred, maimed, have different kinds of disability, and are otherwise not paragons of what they represent in every conceivable way. One of the most important implications of this fact is the Nordic gods are gods that you can disagree with. They're gods you can argue with, and they're gods that you can push back against. Even they, though their power, knowledge, and influence is far greater within myth and in modern heathen practice than any human being could aspire to, have limits and things they don't fully or completely understand. They are also gods which, in some myths, age and most definitely die, as best demonstrated by the myth of Ragnarok, which is most thoroughly illustrated in the Voluspo and attested to in many other sources as well. There are also many groups of Nordic gods. The four main groups that exist within the source material are the Aesir, the Vanir, the Jotnar, and what's referred to in my book and in Fire and Ice practice as the others. The Aesir are the gods of society and human affairs. They're also the most well-known, probably because there's the most in terms of surviving written documents that deal with them. These include gods like Odin, Thor, Tyr, and many of the other Aesir. Their main domains and places of influence are over predominantly human affairs. Odin, for example, is associated with skalds, poetry, inspiration, as well as war and particular ways of dying and demise. Thor, similarly, could be seen as standing in as almost like the god of the working class and workers generally, while Tyr represents justice. A very human and very social and, at times, arbitrary and culturally specific concept. Odin, Thor, and Tyr are not the only members of the Aesir. They're just some of the more well-known and well-represented of this particular group of gods. Next are the Vanir, gods who are most associated, popularly speaking, with the natural world, but I think more specifically are best understood as gods who represent those liminal spaces where human beings are interacting with their environments. Things like sailing, which is associated with Njord, or fertility, which is associated with the god Freyr, or magic, the ultimate boundary-crossing art, which is most strongly associated with Freya. They also have close connections to the Alfar, which is a group of animistic powers who share a similarly liminal, sort of slippery, moving between worlds kind of nature with the Vanir. In the lore, far in the distant cosmic past, the Aesir and Vanir fought a war, and it mostly came to a stalemate because, according to source material, the Aesir were better at war, but the Vanir's greater skill at magic allowed them to effectively grind things to a halt. This led to the two exchanging hostages and becoming allies of a sort within myth. The third group of gods are the Jotnar, often referred to as the giants or the Ettins in other sources. The Jotnar are best understood as the gods of the deep wilderness and the natural world in its greatest glory. This includes Surt, the great fire giant who rules over Muspelheim and is foretold to be the one who will light all the 9 worlds on fire at Ragnarok. Ymir, the slain progenitor of all of reality, who is closely associated with the cold of the era from which Ymir came from. Jord, the earth itself beneath our feet, and many others. One who is often considered Jotun within some branches of heathen practice is Loki, and this is because Loki is referred to in source material as originally coming from the Jotnar. Now granted, many of the other Aesir also have Jotun parentage, including Odin and Tyr and Thor. What further complicates this is there are sources within the Poetic Edda and other places that describe Loki as being of the Aesir, and this is attributed to his oaths that he swore with Odin that effectively made Odin and Loki blood brothers. This is attested to in the Lokasenna, where Loki called Odin on his refusal to allow Loki into the hall by saying, "You once swore that every time you drink, I will drink as well." For these reasons, Loki is also often counted among the Aesir, particularly because even though there are some associations between Loki and elements like fire, that Loki often serves as a trickster, a bringer of chaos and change. That is a thing that's really necessary both within the natural world and within society to keep things refreshed and renewed and prevent stagnation and entropy. Finally, there are the others. And this is a term that I use and is something that's used within Fire and Ice spaces for describing a broad group of beings that don't really seem to have like direct ties with the Aesir, Vanir, or Jotnar, who I think, by the way, it's fair to say are not so much like ethnic groups as they are deliberate societies. Groups of beings that congregate based on shared values and associations and functions rather than being defined by, like, say, specific bloodlines. After all, most of the Aesir are descended from Jotnar, even though they hold themselves as being a separate thing. The others mostly all seem to do their own thing, and even calling them the others is more a way of describing them as deeply primordial beings who are beyond any of these particular associations that define the Aesir, Vanir, and Jotnar. This includes beings like Hela, the goddess of the dead and the grave, who keeps the vast majority of dead within her hall in Helheim, or the Norns, and also figures like the mysterious nameless Sirius, the dragon Nidhogg, Fenrir, Jormungandr, and many others. These are beings that are closely tied with things that are even deeper and more fundamental to how reality ticks than is the case with, say, the Jotnar. Now, just because there are multiple different groups of gods doesn't mean these are hard and fast lines that sharply segregate these groups. There's lots of examples of intermarriage, interrelationship, as well as shared values between these different groups. For two particular examples, aside from the examples I've already given of Aesir who are of Jotun parentage, is the case of Freyr and Gerd, as well as the case of Njord and Skadi. In the case of Freyr and Gerd, things are pretty straightforward in the sense of that the Vanir god Freyr saw Gerd while he was sitting upon Odin's throne and was struck by love and a desire to have her. Trouble was, Gerd was of the Jotun, so this required some more, you could say, complicated negotiations, which is basically what the entire Skirnismal saga is about. This does also doom Freyr to die at Ragnarok because his magical fighting sword was the price that he had to pay to marry Gerd. But I would say this is also an example of sacrifice by the gods to, in some way or another, more fully fulfill who it is that they are. You could say that Freyr's love for Gerd was so great that it was worth risking his demise at Ragnarok. And who said the Norse stuff doesn't get sentimental? In the case of Njord and Skadi, the Vanir god Njord was arranged to be married to the Jotun Skadi as part of recompense for the fact that the Aesir killed Skadi's father. Granted, it was in a situation that you could say was somewhat justified, but nonetheless, Skadi still successfully demanded and received compensation in the form of Njord as her husband. The whole particular story also involves Loki doing some slapstick and a little bit of foot fetishism that Quentin Tarantino would certainly approve of, but that's a story for another time. Eventually, Njord and Skadi divorced for reasons that were unrelated to this whole question of weregild, which, by the way, I think is important that even though Skadi was of the Jotun, and you could even argue the Aesir were pretty justified in killing her father Thiazi, she was still able to demand and receive recompense for that loss. And there's also examples of hospitality being mutually acknowledged between these different groups of gods. The point is, these aren't so much warring groups like, say, angels and demons or heaven and hell, as they are just different, coexisting, sometimes conflicting groups of deity. As for what these gods do within the broader thing that is reality, we know, as per the Völuspá, that within Nordic myth, all the gods came together to collectively craft Midgard, which is to say physical reality as we know it. They also crafted their own particular realms, engaging in these enormous acts of cosmic collective creation. There's also different aspects of human and non-human activity and reality that they have, if not necessarily rulership over, as is more explicitly the case in, like, say, Greek myth, but more like, say, strong influence and connections with those particular things. One great example is the strong association between Odin and ravens. The Nordic gods do sometimes intervene in human affairs and get involved. One great example of this can be found in the Volsunga saga, where the entire chain of events is first set in motion by some business involving Odin and Loki and the Rheingold treasure, and then later on Odin dips his toe a little bit into the waters of that drama when he offers some careful advice to Sigurd as to how to best kill the dragon Fafnir. There's also other stories of gods granting their favor or intervening in particular human affairs, but these don't seem to be the same kind of thing as what you see in, like, say, Christianity, where God is the author of everyone's destiny and fate. I think it might be more accurate to say that there are places and there are moments and circumstances where the interests of the gods intersect with the interests of particular people as well as humanity generally. But the gods also have their own things to do. They have their own affairs and business to attend to, and their focus seems to be a bit more in that direction, as well as the places where they have influence within this world, than necessarily trying to control and manipulate everything according to their particular desires. One tendency that's been noted by modern practitioners, and this is more something that's a modern practitioner thing than necessarily something that exists in historical sources, so treat this with the weight you feel is appropriate, but that generally modern heathen practitioners tend to describe the interventions and acts of the gods within their lives as being very direct and pretty upfront of, this is a god who is trying to get your attention. And even then, it's more, let's talk about this thing and express what my particular opinion is and guidance is on this situation. Part of this, I think, is because the gods don't seem to be the source of free will as we know it within heathen lore, and I think it's actually very strongly implied within the source material that free will and autonomy is just inherent to existence. This is a very different thing from, say, Christian understandings of the creation of humanity, where it took special intervention for humans to get something approximating free will, which is to say the knowledge of good and evil. This also brings me to something that's a significant element of heathen spirituality: the role of sacrifice and offerings. There are some forms of spirituality, both in fiction as well as historically attested to, such as, say, the particular interpretations and practices of the Triple Alliance of Central Mexico, better known as the Aztec Empire, where there was a very clear theology that said sacrifice is necessary to feed the gods, that sacrifice doesn't really seem to do that. Like, the existence of the Nordic gods is, you could say, almost independent of ours. They're going to sort of just keep doing their thing. Now, granted, they are absolutely impacted by what happens in this world. I think it's very significant that one of the first things that happens in the Völuspá, for example, that triggers Ragnarok is human society disintegrating into a war of all against all. But ultimately, there isn't this sense of, if you don't give offerings to Odin, then Odin's going to shrivel up and die. or that the gods need these offerings to perpetuate themselves. Offerings and sacrifices are the kind of exchange of gifts, favors, and affection that make up building and maintaining a relationship with the gods. Not unlike how we will give gifts to friends around like special occasions, like say birthdays or holidays, or buy folks a coffee or a round at the bar or what have you. It's not quite the same as buying a pint for your mate, but you kind of get the picture. The point of sacrifice and offerings is about creating, affirming, and maintaining relationship, as well as making good on specific agreements, rather than being something that is metaphysically necessary for the gods to continue to exist. So, in short, as I think we've gotten to pretty well in this explainer, the Nordic gods have their own particular quirks, expectations, tendencies, and attributes that make them a distinct group of deities within the broader picture that is human spirituality. Those tendencies are consistent across all the different groups of Nordic gods, and they are things that are pretty essential for understanding this particular spirituality. Most important to that is how these gods have limits, they are not perfect beings, and the relationship with them is much more one of building relationship with something that is, while extremely powerful and influential, is ultimately a being to know and develop, you could almost say like friendship or patronage with, rather than necessarily being something that you must submit to or else. This is also different from what you might see in other polytheisms because, every form of spirituality, and particularly every form of polytheism, has its own understanding about what gods are and why. So, thank you for listening to my first ever explainer. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share, and tune in for future explainers on similar topics. Thank you again for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.